Hello, members, and anyone who tunes in on the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. We're continuing the Salem witch trials and an economy that is just literally falling to pieces. The conflict was quickly approaching Essex County, escalating fear of attack. When Captain John Alden, the future accused witch, came into Marblehead in July 1690 to remove several cannon that defended the harbour so that they could be used in the invasion of Quebec, he was met with what the General Court call an insurrection of the people. The Marblehead militia captains ordered the beating of the drums, which soon gathered 60 to 70 men who angrily refused to let Alden strip the town of its defences. The irate mob on the waterfront of Marblehead may have reminded Alden of the fate of the two Wabanaki captives brought into port in 1677. He wisely did not press the issue and returned to Boston empty-handed. Many Salem residents had suffered firsthand in King William's War. In the early 1680s, numerous Essex County men had bought land in Maine, which was being resettled after the destruction of King Philip's War. Some of these men merely joined the widespread speculation in frontier lands that took place during the decade, but a good number of families moved up to Maine and settled there. For example, in 1680, the General Court granted the township of West Costugo, that's present-day Yarmouth, Maine, to 13 men, almost all from Essex County. The proprietors included George and John Ingersoll and Captain John Putnam's son, Jonathan. George, John, and 3 other Ingersolls are included on the 1688 list of the owners of the house lots in Falmouth, a few miles south of West Costugo. The more of the Ingersolls' kinsmen, brothers Robert and John Nicholson, are on the list, as is Thomas Cloyce, the uncle of the afflicted girl Mercy Lewis. And we all know who Mercy is if you followed witch trials and how they happened before. Mercy is indeed one of those characters you do not forget. Robert Nicholson was married to Winifred Bonithon, whose family were the proprietors of Saco. Her niece was the afflicted Sarah Churchwell. These and many other former residents of Salem and Essex County sought refuge down south when they had to abandon their main homes, those who survived, that is. Thomas Cloyce was killed when Falmouth was attacked in 1690. His sister-in-law, Sarah Cloyce, would be executed for witchcraft only 2 years later. More than 40 participants in the Salem witch trials, from afflicted girls and accused witches to Governor Phipps, had lived in Maine, owned land there, or had a close family member from the frontier. In the Exodus, people had lost their lives and their homes, and real estate speculations were now worthless. Residents of Salem and surrounding towns had to take in evacuees, while also sending loved ones north to fight. Everyone contributed higher taxes to pay for the war and to care for the refugees, and many waited in fear for the Wabanaki and their French allies to attack Essex County. The war had impact on the witch trials in 1692. New Englanders had long considered the native population to be heathens in league with the devil. How surprising is that? Because they also believed that our pagans over here were heathens and in league with the devil. Oh dear me. In the course of the 17th century, French fur trades and Jesuit missionaries in northern New England and the borderlands of Quebec and Acadia had cemented an alliance with the Wabanaki and converted many of them to Catholicism. In the minds of the Puritans, the only thing that could possibly be worse than being a heathen was to be a Catholic. This is why it really does, oh my gosh. English fears of Catholics have been confirmed by the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. We will get into the Gunpowder Plot, guys, and it will be available for everybody when we get to November. No, it's already pre-recorded and ready to go. In November, you will hear of the gun plot trial and of its characters that actually did this and tried to pull it off. That's what sent madness in Catholics were evil and bad. It sort of was created from the gunpowder plot, which you'll hear about later on. When Cable had threatened to blow up Parliament. Yes, that's what happened. Those qualms had been nurtured by the Stuarts, who earnestly desired to rule as Catholic absolute monarchs, and the fears came into full bloom in the Popish Plot, 1679 to 81, a fictitious conspiracy to take over England and Scotland that resulted in widespread anti-Catholic hysteria, and it did in England. They killed many Catholics, said they were witches, said they were in league with the devil. They were Catholics. Pope and his minions, along with their heathen associates, had allied with Satan to destroy New England. So they said. Soon the discovery of the plan for a slave insurrection suggested that slaves had joined Satan's unholy alliance. In 1690, an escaped slave revealed the plot when he was captured. He claimed he had run away to join Isaac Morel, a French speaker from the Isle of Jersey, who had recently arrived in Newbury. The slave claimed that Morel had been spying in the region in preparation for an invasion of northern Essex County by 500 Native Americans and 300 French troops. The freed slave and Indian slaves would add to this onslaught. Then there was a second slave confirmed that Morel, aided by the French fleet, planned to destroy the English and their settlements. Morel was soon arrested and put in jail, thus foiling the plan. The growing war panic, combined with losses in Maine and the failure of Quebec expedition, did nothing to ease the growing partisanship in the provincial politics, providing more evidence for Satan's presence. It's all to do with Satan, guys. This Satan's very busy, isn't he, in the lives of people. Look, let me just put this. Satan does not need to come into our lives to destroy it. We destroy ourselves, okay? We do enough of that to ourselves. We are human. We are not perfect. God knows this. That's why we must seek solace in Jesus and Mother Mary and God to forgive us our sins because we were born to sin. I doubt there is just these... Well, I mean, there must be many, right? Because it's happening all over the world at the same time. So Satan's very freaking busy. No, guys, no. There had been some political disagreements under the old charter, but nothing like the factionalism that began to emerge after the Glorious Revolution. Andros had been a lightning rod. Removing him was something almost all people could agree upon. Once he was gone from office, the provisional government of Bradstreet, the most of its old deputies, now without a charter, reported to England and awaited word of the formation of an official government. Unfortunately, William and Mary were busy with more pressing matters at stake, and it would be 2 years before government Phipps would arrive with a new charter. In the meantime, factions began to re-emerge. Puritan conservatives pressed for a return of the 1629 Charter. A die-hard royalists wanted a continuation of the domination of New England. In between, there were a range of opinions, though the common denominator was a desire for a competent and honest administration that could effectively defend the colony. With the provisional government seemingly powerless to stop the reverses in the war, the complaints against it grew. There was a major shift in politics and political leadership in the 1680s in the towns throughout Massachusetts. The politics of defence gave way to a new order, as more men became actively involved in local politics. In large part, this was a response to two related factors: war and taxes. King Philip's War had placed a substantial new burden on each town to provide money and soldiers for the colony. Taxes skyrocketed during the war. For example, from June 1675 to August 1676, Woburn paid £530 in taxes, a far cry from the £30 it paid the previous year. And back then, guys, that's like millions, thousands today, you know. Back then, it was a real lot, like a real lot. The colonies' rates consisted in part of poll tax, a regressive tax on individuals which made a much heavier proportional burden on the poor. Although fewer rates were called for after the war ended, taxes remained several times above their pre-war levels. High taxes in a post-war economic slump meant the 1680s were a decade of hardship. In 1684, no less an authority than Governor Bradstreet warned Edward Randolph, "The people here, as you know, are generally very poor." That same year, the small central Massachusetts town of Mendon complained to the General Court that the colony's taxes were so high they could no longer afford to hire a minister. Growing taxes led to increased attention to the participation in town meetings, rising acrimony, and heated debates over budgets and other matters. Massachusetts towns had always had their internal divisions and disputes, but deference had been shown to traditional leaders. After the parties were asked to pray and reflect over the matter, they usually reached a peaceful compromise. In the 1680s, however, those long-standing community leaders and political brokers were being turned out of office by an angry electorate. It was a generational change, as younger men assumed a growing role in governing the colony. The change was also felt in the town militias. As war began in 1688 and men were called to duty on the frontier, they demanded to be led by officers they trusted. Commanders with decades of experience frequently were seen as old and out of touch, and younger men were voted in, often those who had actively campaigned for the post. Such self-serving efforts were also new to Massachusetts politics. In February 1690, the General Court added to this explosive mix by expanding suffrage. Now, any adult male of good character who owned a modest amount of property and paid taxes could become a freeman of the colony. Some estimate that it's approximately 10% of the adult males of the colony eagerly took up the opportunity to become free men in the 60 days following the legislation. Regardless of who was elected, the interim government seemed completely unable to run the war against the French and their native allies. Since most of the fighting occurred in New Hampshire and Maine, much of the responsibility fell to the men of nearby Essex County. Salem's Bartholomew Gedney, colonel of the Essex County militia, was particularly busy. In May 1690, when residents of Wells threatened to abandon their town unless they received support from the militia, Gedney scrambled to find troops. Sergeant John Walcott of Salem village offered to serve, but his father, Captain Jonathan Walcott, had difficulty finding men to accompany his son, especially on such short notice. Several months later, Gedney was trying to raise more troops, this time targeting the Maine men who were living a tentative existence and sort of as refugees in Salem. Most lacked proper homes and jobs and were probably desperate for work and eager for revenge against the Wabanaki. Gedney optimistically declared them prompt and ready for service. As recruiting became more difficult and resources drained away, it became increasingly clear that the colony needed aid. On November the 29th, 1690, Gedney, Stephen Sewell, John Higginson, Jr. that is, were among 10 Salem men who wrote the governor and assistants urging them to ask the Crown for help in the war. Being under a deep sense of deplorable condition of this poor country by reason of our French and Indian enemies. The following April, Gedney and William Stoughton were among the 7 commissioners appointed to go to Wells to negotiate the extension of a truce. Gedney did not actually make the trip, but 4 other commissioners did, and the natives agreed to a temporary extension. By this time, Wells was the northernmost settlement left in Maine. All the English townships north of it had been abandoned by the settlers and destroyed by the Wabanaki and their French allies. The colony seemed poised to fall into anarchy. The growing military and financial disaster highlighted the interim government's ineffectiveness. People began to publicly call the government into question, and soldiers' resentment grew as their paper money continued to lose value. An increasingly partisan general court wrestled with these problems without solution. The optimism of the glorious revolution was gone, and people yearned for the government that would be stable, and then it would stabilise the colony. As one pessimistic writer put it, I question whether we shall live to see any more happy days. Cotton Mather believed the terrible events was a sign of the pending second coming of Christ. I am verily persuaded the judge is at the door. I do without any hesitation venture to say, the great day of the Lord is near. It is near, and it hastens greatly. Finally, in the late 1691, there was some hope that steady and secure government was coming. After many months of careful negotiations between the Massachusetts agents and the Crown, a new charter was issued for Massachusetts Bay on October the 7th, 1691. The charter gave unprecedented privileges for a royal colony, confirmed ownership of Maine, and incorporated Plymouth colony into an expanded Massachusetts Bay colony. Although the deputies to the Assembly would be elected by the freemen of the colony, and the Assembly would elect the Governor's Council, the Governor, who was appointed by the King, would have far-reaching power. He would be able to veto the choice of the councillors, and obviously, as well as the Assembly's bills. The Governor and Council would have full control of the appointment of sheriffs, judges, and other officials. This was a vast improvement on the Dominion of New England, but it would be far from enough for the Puritan All God. While Increase Mather grudgingly accepted the new charter as the best they could, his fellow agents, Elisha Cook and Thomas Oakes, instead looked for a legal challenge or other ways to block the new charter. They were particularly angered over the liberty of conscience granted to all Protestants, which meant that Massachusetts was no longer a Puritan colony. Indeed, the charter confirmed the change already made by the provisional government. Free men of the colony no longer needed to be members of the Puritan Church. They could actually be Catholics, guys, if they wanted to be. Isn't that nice? Unfortunately, the new charter left many things still up in the air. It essentially voided all laws of Massachusetts Bay, leaving the substantial task of rewriting them to the new government. The irregularities noted by Andros now had to be addressed. All laws had to be in harmony with English law, and any laws passed had to be approved by the Crown. This presented the legislature with a huge and pressing task, for the colony functioned in something of a legal no man's land until a new law code was passed and approved by Parliament. Until that time, no legal decision was truly on firm ground, extending the uncertainty that begun under the Dominion and continued under Bradstreet's interim government. The problem was particularly acute for the judicial system, which had to be recreated by the General Court. Many people had been unwilling to bring their civil cases before Andros's court, which they saw was biased, and the uncertainties, critics would go as far as to label it anarchy, of the intercharter years, did nothing to encourage people to come forward. So by 1692, there was a reservoir of pent-up local complaints and differences between neighbours. Unfortunately, of course, we know that usually when that happens, it leads to saying they are witches when they're just neighbours having an argument, The new charter provided no immediate solution for this. The county courts could not meet until they were recreated by the legislature. This meant that unresolved conflicts would continue to grow and boil over, with some disputes even helping to fuel the witchcraft accusations. You see? There it is again. People falling out with their neighbours, an issue arises. It cannot be, let's say, steadied or settled. It boils over. Well, then you're a witch. Great. Fantastic. Brilliant. Oh, my days. The competence of the new governor, Sir William Phips, was also a concern. Although he was a political ally of Mather's, he was a rustic character from Maine, only recently accepted for membership in the Mathers Church. He had little political experience, and the colony was just still recovering from a failed Quebec expedition. Even worse, it would be months before Phips arrived in Massachusetts to assume authority under the new charter, although rumours of the new charter and Phips' appointment had been swirling for months. News of the appointment reached Massachusetts only in the late January 1692, about the time that witchcraft accusations were beginning in Salem village. The new government would not arrive in the colony until May the 14th. In the meantime, uncertainty, instability, would build up like the storm over the city upon the hill. And that's the next part of our Salem witch trials. So, as you can see, it's a mess, right? The government's a mess. There's too many wars, that's a mess. There's too many taxes, that's a mess. There is arguments left, right and centre over property and lands, that's a mess. There is arguments with neighbours over stupid little things that are just getting out of control now and are going to boil over. There is also the question that all of a sudden Catholics are hated because they're working for Satan. Oh my days. Yeah, this is what they think. They think Catholics are working for Satan. Naughty, naughty. Anyway, when we come back, we'll be on to drawing battle lines in Salem village. Think it's going to get worse from here, guys. I don't think it's going to get better. It does not sound like it's heading for a better place anyway. Thank you for listening and many blessings.